Israel bombs Gaza, Gaza fires back with rockets. That's the impression you get when you follow the news. But is that really true? One news report quickly follows the other. At times, it's very difficult to understand what really is going on. What is the cause of this conflict? How could it escalate like this? And what are the interests at stake? In this explainer, we hope to provide you with some more insights. In the media, you often hear that the current unrest began in the Arab neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. That's mainly Palestinians living there. It's a home of a Palestinian family that's been living in this area since the 1950s, is threatened with eviction to make room for Jewish settlers. That's the story you hear in the media. But what is really going on? To find out, we need to take you back to 1948. After Israel declared its independence, an Arab legion attacked Israel. When the war ended, the borders changed. Jordan occupied East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, known by many as the West Bank. All Jews were expelled from the West Bank. It was ethnically cleansed. The house in question was owned by a Jewish family until 1948, but they were no longer allowed to live there by the Jordanians. Instead, an Arab family was settled there, and they are there to this very day. Meanwhile, East Jerusalem was reconquered by Israel in 1967, and many people believe the area is occupied by Israel. Israel claims it is part of the State of Israel. The Palestinians, or many of them, don't want Jews to live there. And over this particular house, all kinds of lawsuits have been pending since the 1970s. The Palestinian family that's been living there has been refusing to pay rent and also refuses a substitute home. The Jewish owners, who have proved ownership of the land, are trying to get their property back. So they took the matter to the Israeli courts, which decided that the Jewish family is the owner of the house. An appeal was made against this decision, and again, that ruling was in favor of the Jewish family. The case is now before the Supreme Court. It's often said in the media that Israeli judges always rule against the Palestinians, but this is not the case. Israel has an independent judicial system, and in recent years, it's often happened that Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria have had to be evacuated because they've been built on Palestinian property. And so the courts often decided in favor of Palestinian claims when Jewish villages were then evicted. So it's not true that all Palestinians always bear the brunt of Israeli court decisions. Now, this was not the only reason for the current unrest. There's been much more happening. For the first time in 15 years, Palestinian elections would have taken place. But again, they were postponed by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. This to the great frustration of Palestinians, as many of them felt this was the opportunity for them to elect a new leadership in the Palestinian Authority, which they feel does not represent them. In addition, it was Ramadan until May 12. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims were allowed to come and pray on the Temple Mount where the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque stand. By the way, Jews and Christians are not allowed to go there. There was a lot of turmoil. It was proved after the event that stones had been stored in order to provoke a riot. And rioting Palestinian youths threw stones, Molotov cocktails, at Israeli law enforcement agencies. The situation was out of control. The army intervened to prevent further escalation. Now, during that escalation of violence, on Monday, the 10th of May, Israel celebrated Yom Yerushalayim, the Jewish holiday that celebrates the unity of Jerusalem. And on that day, Hamas, the terrorist organization in control of Gaza to the south of Israel, decided to get involved in the conflict. And they cast themselves as the saviors of Jerusalem, unlike the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. A very strategic move politically, as there's a lot of frustration among the Palestinians about the inaction of their own Palestinian leaders in Ramallah. And by doing so, Hamas hoped to become more popular among the Palestinians. So there's a power struggle going on between Hamas, which is in control of Gaza, and Fatah, which is in control of the West Bank. And when you realize that Hamas states in its own official charter that Israel must be destroyed as a Jewish state and that all Jews must be driven into the sea, you realize there is a serious threat to the state of Israel. Hamas began firing thousands of rockets from Gaza into Israel. These are not amateur rockets, but serious warheads. They have been supplied, the rockets themselves and technology to build rockets, by Iran, which has the objective of destroying the state of Israel. These rockets have a huge range with capacity to reach Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and the other major cities in Israel. So aiming rockets indiscriminately at civilians with the intent to kill is a war crime. At the same time, riots broke out in many places in Israel between Arab and Jewish residents. Synagogues were destroyed and people were molested in the streets. There were lynchings on both sides. The frustration on each side is enormous. Because of Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, most of the Hamas rockets did not reach their target. Hamas rockets are designed to cause as many Israeli civilian casualties as possible. Hamas targets schools, hospitals, and densely populated residential areas in Israel. It's not new for Hamas to fire rockets. On the contrary, for almost 20 years, rockets from Gaza have been a daily reality for the people living especially in the southern part of Israel. Israel responded to those rockets with precision bombing in Gaza in order to disable the terrorists and destroy their rocket installations. Now, what complicates matters is that Hamas hides those rocket installations in densely populated civilian areas of the Gaza Strip. They use their civilians as human shields, men, women, and children. This too is a war crime. The news often mentions the number of deaths caused by the conflict. For example, it's often said 192 Palestinians killed compared with only 10 Israelis, giving the impression that Israelis are much more violent than Palestinians, that the Israeli IDF is using disproportionate force to destroy Hamas. But this is not correct. First of all, there is evidence that a number of the Palestinian casualties were caused by their own failed Hamas rockets. Secondly, the Israeli Iron Dome system, which protects Israel from rockets, has been instrumental in preventing most of the Hamas rockets from actually reaching Israelis. So many more Israelis would have been killed were it not for the Iron Dome system. Unfortunately, it does not look like things will calm down in Israel anytime soon. Israel is intending to dismantle as many Hamas terror facilities as possible so that in a month's time it won't be the same old story with the rockets. There is a worldwide outrage at the violence used by Israel. Is this outrage justified? Aren't the Palestinians really suffering primarily because of the crimes of their own leadership? This conflict is very complicated. It is very easy to criticize Israel from the sidelines. There is much pain and grief on both sides. Innocent civilians are the victims of violence. The bottom line is that Israel is engaged in a long-term, existential, fierce struggle against terrorist regimes that are sponsored and supported by Iran and other regimes in the region. This is not a one-off conflict between Israel and Hamas. This goes deeper and is concerned with Israel's right to exist in the region.